Have you heard of the sons of Ishmael, those who, though not part of the lineage of the divine promise made to Abraham, received a special blessing from God? The story of Ishmael and his descendants is marked by challenges, conquests, and a legacy that spans centuries, impacting biblical history and beyond. Prepare to meet one of the most intriguing peoples in the Bible, the Ishmaelites. Direct descendants of Ishmael, the firstborn son of Abraham, they not only fulfilled the prophecies about them but also left a profound mark on trade, wars, and relations with other nations. What they represent goes far beyond what you might imagine upon hearing their name for the first time. At the end of this story, you will understand that Ishmael's inheritance is a powerful lesson about God's promises. Let's unravel this mystery together and realize that even those who are not the primary chosen ones have a fundamental role in God's plans. The story of Ishmael begins with a promise. Abraham, the patriarch of nations, was blessed by God with the promise of being the father of a great lineage. However, before his son of the promise, Isaac, was born, Abraham had a son with Hagar, his Egyptian servant. This son, Ishmael, was the result of a human solution to the problem of Sarah's sterility, Abraham's wife. But God had plans for Ishmael that would far exceed the expectations of his mother and father. Though Ishmael was not the heir to God's covenant with Abraham, he received a unique blessing. God promised that Ishmael would be the father of 12 princes and that a great nation would come from him. The importance of Ishmael and his descendants, the Ishmaelites, is often underestimated. But they play a crucial role in the unfolding of biblical history and in the formation of various nations. But who were these Ishmaelites? How did they relate to other peoples, especially to the Israelites, their cousins, and what role did they play in the history of God's people? Throughout this video, we will delve into these questions and explore the spiritual and historical legacy left by Ishmael's descendants. The Bible offers us glimpses of the Ishmaelites at crucial moments in the narrative. They were nomadic traders and warriors. Perhaps most famously, they were the ones who bought Joseph, the son of Jacob, and sold him as a slave in Egypt, forever changing the course of his life and the very history of Israel. So let's understand together how the promise made to Abraham also extended to Ishmael, how the Ishmaelites became a significant force in the ancient world, and what the Bible teaches us through this fascinating lineage. And before we continue, if you enjoy exploring the mysteries of the scriptures, subscribe to the channel, it's free, and every new piece of knowledge can be a blessing in your life. Let's explore in depth the role and legacy of Ishmael's descendants, starting with the promise that gave rise to this lineage and moving forward through their journey throughout biblical history and its spiritual implications. The story of Ishmael begins even before his birth, in an engaging plot that revolves around Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar, and that reveals much about the nature of faith and trust in God's promises. When God called Abraham, he promised that he would be the father of a great nation, even though his wife Sarah was barren and they were both of advanced age. Time passed, and the promise of a son had not yet been fulfilled. Sarah, consumed by impatience and doubt, suggested that Abraham have a child with Hagar, her Egyptian servant. Though this was not the way God had planned to fulfill his promise, Abraham accepted the suggestion, and Hagar conceived. This moment marks the beginning of Ishmael's story, who even before he was born, bore the weight of being the fruit of a human attempt to help God in his plan. The relationship between Sarah and Hagar soon deteriorated after Hagar became pregnant. Sarah felt scorned, and in a moment of anger, she treated Hagar harshly. The tension between the two women resulted in Hagar fleeing to the desert. It was there, alone and helpless, that the angel of the Lord appeared to her with a surprising message. God not only comforted Hagar but also gave her a promise for her son Ishmael. He would be the father of a great nation. Furthermore, the angel prophetically described Ishmael, saying that he would be like a wild donkey, free, untamed, and that his hand would be against everyone, and the hand of everyone against him. Ishmael was born, and for many years he was the only son of Abraham. During this time, Abraham loved his firstborn son and possibly believed that he could be the heir to the divine promise. However, when Isaac was born, as God had promised, the family dynamics changed drastically. Sarah, seeing Ishmael playing with Isaac, asked Abraham to expel Hagar and her son. Sarah's request disturbed Abraham, but God guided him to obey, assuring him that though Isaac was the heir to the covenant, Ishmael would also be blessed and become the father of a great nation. Genesis 21 verses 12 to 23. The story of Ishmael presents us with a series of contrasts. He was not the son of the promise, yet he was still blessed. He was expelled from Abraham's home, but God did not abandon him. When Hagar and Ishmael were sent into the desert, it seemed their fate would be death. However, in a moment of despair, when the water ran out, and Hagar was unable to watch her son die, she went away to weep. God intervened once more. The angel of the Lord called to Hagar, encouraging her not to fear, for God had heard Ishmael's cry and witnessed a well of water in the desert. Genesis 21 verse 17. This scene not only demonstrates God's compassion, but also the faithfulness of his promises, even for those who were not directly at the center of the plan of salvation that he was orchestrating through Isaac. Ishmael grew up in the desert, becoming an archer and establishing his life in the land of Paran. He married an Egyptian woman and, as promised by God, fathered 12 sons who became princes of their own tribes. These descendants formed what the Bible calls the 12 princes of Ishmael, Genesis 25:3:16. These tribes spread out across the region of the Arabian desert and became known as the Ishmaelites. Although the scriptures do not give many details about Ishmael's personal life, his impact is seen at several crucial moments in biblical history, especially in his descendants. The Ishmaelites are often described as nomads, inhabiting the desert and leading a life of herding and trade. They did not have a fixed home but lived in constant movement, leading caravans of camels across the desert sands. This nomadic characteristic is in line with the prophecy that Ishmael would live on the edge of his brothers, Genesis 16, an independent people resistant to the domination of other nations, and known for their skill in survival in harsh, arid conditions. The Ishmaelites play a significant role in one of the best-known episodes in the Old Testament, the sale of Joseph. When Joseph's brothers, driven by jealousy, decided to get rid of him, they initially planned to kill him. However, seeing a caravan of Ishmaelites approaching, Judah suggested that they sell him as a slave. The Ishmaelites, who were on their way to Egypt, bought Joseph and took him with them, Genesis 37 verses 2-28. This event marked a turning point in Joseph's life, for it was in Egypt that he went from slave to governor, saving his family and the whole of Egypt from a devastating famine. Although this incident portrays the Ishmaelites as mere slave traders, it also demonstrates how Ishmael's lineage, even indirectly, influenced the course of Israel's history. In addition to their presence in the slave trade, the Ishmaelites were also known for their commercial caravans, transporting spices, perfumes, and other precious goods across the desert. They played a crucial role in trade between the East and Egypt, acting as important intermediaries for the flow of goods. This prominent position in trade allowed the Ishmaelites to become a significant force in the economy of the time, further reinforcing God's promise that Ishmael would be the father of a great nation. The relationship between the Ishmaelites and the Israelites, however, was not always peaceful. Though they were descendants of the same father, Abraham, their histories were marked by rivalries and conflicts. The dispute between Isaac and Ishmael seems to have perpetuated itself in subsequent generations, with the tribes of Ishmael frequently in opposition to the tribes of Israel. This tension can be seen as a continuation of the prophecy about Ishmael that his hand would be against everyone and the hand of everyone against him. The rivalry between these two peoples also symbolizes the greater conflict between God's promises and human attempts to control destiny. As was the case with Ishmael's birth, the history of Ishmael's descendants, however, is not limited to the biblical context. In Islamic tradition, Ishmael is seen as the direct ancestor of the Arabs, and his importance is fundamental in the genealogy that leads to the Prophet Muhammad. According to Islamic tradition, it was in Mecca that Ishmael and his mother Hagar settled, and their God provided water from the well of Zamzam, which became a sacred place for Muslims. The connection between Ishmael and Islam offers a different perspective on his descendants, showing how the promise made to Abraham that Ishmael would be the father of a great nation was fulfilled in ways that transcend the scope of the traditional biblical narrative. Throughout the scriptures, we also find mentions of the prophecies about the Ishmaelites. The verse that describes Ishmael as a wild donkey can be interpreted as a metaphor for the fierce independence and free spirit that characterized his lineage. He would be a people difficult to control, living on the fringes of great civilizations, maintaining their autonomy and resisting any attempt at domination. This image of the Ishmaelites as a strong and resilient people echoes throughout history, for they survived for centuries in a challenging environment, thriving as nomads and traders. Spiritually, the story of Ishmael offers us many lessons. It reminds us that even when circumstances seem difficult, God does not forget his promises. Though Ishmael was not the son of the covenant, God took care of him, heard his cry in the desert, and blessed him greatly. This shows us that God's plan is comprehensive and includes everyone, even those who seem to be on the margins of the main story. Ishmael's blessing is proof of God's love and mercy, which does not abandon anyone, regardless of their position or circumstance. Furthermore, Ishmael's life is a powerful example of how human choices can influence but not alter divine plans. Sarah and Abraham tried to help God by conceiving Ishmael, but this did not prevent the fulfillment of the original promise of a son through Sarah. Still, God incorporated Ishmael into his plan, showing that he can work through our flaws and imperfect decisions to fulfill his will. Finally, the trajectory of the Ishmaelites also challenges us to reflect on the rivalries and divisions that arise between peoples. Though Ishmael and Isaac were brothers, their descendants followed different and often conflicting paths. Nevertheless, God's promise to both reveals his desire to bless all the nations of the earth. This points to the need for reconciliation and understanding, even between those who seem destined for conflict. And before continuing to the next stage of this fascinating story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share this message. Together, we can continue discovering the riches of the scriptures and applying their teachings to our daily lives. May God's blessing be upon you. The story of Ishmael and his descendants, the Ishmaelites, carries complexities that go far beyond a simple family narrative. It is a plot that, when examined more closely, reveals profound questions about divine promises, the consequences of human choices, and the interaction between peoples with shared legacies and, at the same time, conflicting ones. At the center of it all, we see the fulfillment of God's words regarding Ishmael, but also the emergence of dynamics that echo through generations. In the previous development, we explored the beginning of this story, from Ishmael's birth, his expulsion along with Hagar, and the beginning of his lineage as the father of 12 princes. Now it is time to delve into the deeper implications and resulting conflicts of this inheritance. Right from the start, the prophecy about Ishmael points to a destiny marked by independence and difficulty in coexisting with other peoples. The angel who appeared to Hagar in the desert shortly after her escape gave her a glimpse of her son's future, describing him as a wild donkey, Genesis 16 verse 12. This image may seem harsh, but in the biblical context, it reflects the nature of an untamed people, free and resistant to external forces. The Ishmaelites would be a people who would live on the margins, always moving in search of survival and fighting for their own autonomy. The prophecy also mentions that Ishmael's hand would be against everyone, and the hand of everyone against him, suggesting a life of constant conflicts and tensions, something that would come to be confirmed in history. The tensions between the Ishmaelites and other biblical peoples, particularly the Israelites, began early on. Although Ishmael and Isaac were brothers, the circumstances of their births and the promises surrounding each of them created an inevitable rivalry. Isaac, as the son of the promise, inherited God's covenant with Abraham, while Ishmael, despite being the firstborn, was destined to be the father of a great nation, but outside the lineage of the messianic promise. This conflict between the two lineages can be seen not only as a family dispute but also as a greater illustration of the struggles between divine choice and human solutions, between the primary blessing and the secondary blessing. The episode of Ishmael and Hagar's expulsion represents one of these tensions. Abraham loved his son Ishmael, and the idea of expelling him was agonizing. However, Sarah, concerned for the safety and future of her own son Isaac, insisted that Hagar and Ishmael leave. God, recognizing Abraham's suffering, assured him that Ishmael would also be blessed and become the father of a great nation. However, the act of expelling Ishmael formalized the separation between him and Isaac's lineage, solidifying the bifurcation of the two paths, that of Isaac, heir to the promise, and that of Ishmael, the firstborn, who would follow his own destiny. This separation led to a legacy of conflicts and rivalries throughout the scriptures. The Ishmaelites appear at key moments, often in opposition to the descendants of Isaac and Jacob. The sale of Joseph to a caravan of Ishmaelites was an event that, besides changing Joseph's destiny, also symbolized the interaction between these two peoples. Though the Ishmaelites were not directly enemies of the Israelites at that moment, the fact that they became the means by which Joseph was taken to Egypt marks a point of tension. The story of Joseph, however, shows that even in rivalries and adversities, God can transform evil into good. What seemed to be an act of betrayal and ruin on the part of Joseph's brothers, facilitated by the Ishmaelites, became the path by which God provided salvation for the entire nation of Israel during the famine that struck the region years later. The Ishmaelites, as nomads, also played a significant role in the economy and trade of the region. They were known for their caravans that transported spices, perfumes, and other precious goods across the desert. This nomadic and commercial lifestyle aligned with the prophecy about their descendants being free and difficult to subdue. Unlike the Israelites, who settled in the land of Canaan, the Ishmaelites continued to live on the move, adapting to the hardships of the desert and dominating the trade routes that connected the east to Egypt and the rest of the world. This economic role not only made them an important force in the ancient Near East region, but it also put them in frequent contact with other peoples, including the Israelites. The impact of the Ishmaelites, however, is not limited to the biblical world. According to Islamic tradition, Ishmael is considered the direct ancestor of the Arabs, and his legacy is deeply intertwined with the history of Islam. Islamic tradition recounts that Ishmael and his mother Hagar settled in Mecca, where God's provision of water, the well of Zamzam, saved their lives. This well later became a sacred place for Muslims, and Ishmael is seen as an ancestor of the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam. Thus, Ishmael's lineage not only plays an important role in Jewish Christian scriptures, but also extends to Islamic traditions, creating a link between these three great monotheistic religions. This aspect of Ishmael's legacy is particularly fascinating because it demonstrates how a promise made by God to Abraham encompassed not only one lineage but several nations and religions. Although Isaac was the heir to the divine covenant that would result in the nation of Israel and eventually the coming of Jesus Christ, Ishmael was also blessed in a unique way. His lineage gave rise to a great nation, the Arabs, and his importance in Islamic tradition shows that God's promises have a far wider scope than we might initially imagine. Beyond his historical and religious impact, the life of Ishmael and the journey of his descendants teach us profound spiritual lessons. One of the most powerful aspects of this narrative is the way God took care of Ishmael even when he was expelled from Abraham's home. In many ways, Ishmael can be seen as someone marginalized, not only by his family, but also by the history of redemption, which would focus on Isaac and his descendants. However, God never abandoned him. When Hagar and Ishmael were on the verge of death in the desert, it was God who provided a well of water for them. This divine intervention is a reminder that God cares for everyone, regardless of their position in the main narrative. The prophecy itself about Ishmael, that he would be like a wild donkey, can be seen in a new light when we consider God's care for him. Instead of being a condemnation, this description points to the independence and resilience of Ishmael and his descendants. They would be free, incapable of being subdued by others, and live on the margins, but with God's protection and blessing. This image contrasts with the idea that only the chosen ones of the main promise are cared for by God. The story of Ishmael shows us that even outside the main covenant, there is still room for blessings, provisions, and divine care. Throughout history, the lineage of Ishmael continued to play an important role in the region. As mentioned earlier, the Ishmaelites were frequently in conflict with the descendants of Isaac, especially the Israelites. These conflicts, though often painful, are part of a larger narrative about the interaction between different nations and how God works in the midst of these tensions. The rivalry between Ishmaelites and Israelites can be seen as an extension of the tensions between Ishmael and Isaac, but also as a reflection of the broader divisions that arise when different groups try to claim their place in the divine plan. These conflicts, however, do not negate the promises made to Ishmael. God promised that he would be the father of a great nation, and this promise was fulfilled in various ways. The Ishmaelites prospered as traders, shepherds, and warriors. They spread out across vast areas of the desert and became a respected and feared people for their ability to survive in harsh conditions and their fierce independence. The very strength and resilience of the Ishmaelites is a testament to the faithfulness of God, who kept his promise to Ishmael, even though he was not the heir to the main covenant. When considering Ishmael's legacy, is essential to reflect on what it teaches us about God's character. Ishmael's story shows us that God is faithful to his promises, regardless of the circumstances. Although Ishmael wasn't the son of the messianic promise, God still honored the promise made to Abraham and greatly blessed his descendants. This reminds us that God's love is inclusive and his blessings extend to all people, not just those at the center of his redemptive plans. Furthermore, Ishmael's life challenges us to rethink our own expectations about how God works. We often think that God only acts in grand and visible ways, but Ishmael's story shows us that God is also present in the margins, working silently and blessing those who seem to be outside the main narrative. Ultimately, the life and legacy of Ishmael invite us to see God's story in a broader, more inclusive way. The promises made to Ishmael and God's care for him teach us that in his sovereign plan, there is room for everyone. While not everyone is at the center of the redemptive covenant, everyone can experience God's love, mercy, and provision. May we learn from Ishmael's story to trust in God's promises and to recognize that God in his wisdom always fulfills his word, even in ways we may not fully understand. If this story has touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue exploring these fascinating narratives and discover how the scriptures can transform our understanding of the world and our own spiritual journey. Each subscription is a step of faith that opens doors for more blessings and divine wisdom. May God continue to bless your life with new revelations. The conclusion of Ishmael's story and his descendants is both a celebration of God's faithfulness and an invitation for us to reflect on the depth of his plan and the inclusion of all people in the divine narrative. Ishmael's journey, from his birth to the establishment of his lineage, is permeated by moments of tension, rejection, and blessing. When we look at the bigger picture, we realize that Ishmael's story carries profound lessons about God's sovereignty, the complexity of human relationships, and the breadth of the divine plan that goes beyond the boundaries of a single nation or group. At the heart of Ishmael's trajectory is God's promise to Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. The promise of Isaac, the son of the covenant, is often the focus of this narrative, but the blessing given to Ishmael shows us that God's grace also extends to those who are outside the direct line of this promise. God, in his infinite wisdom and justice, not only blessed Isaac with the messianic promise, but also ensured that Ishmael would be the father of a great nation. This is a powerful reminder that God does not abandon those who, for various reasons, may appear on the sidelines of his main plan. On the contrary, he embraces them in his grace and fulfills his promises in unexpected and impactful ways. As we have seen, Ishmael's life is marked by a tension between acceptance and rejection. He was Abraham's firstborn son, but not the son of the promise. He was loved by his father, but rejected by Abraham's wife, Sarah. He was banished along with his mother, Hagar, and had to find his way in the wilderness. This experience of exile could have been the end of Ishmael's story, but it actually marked the beginning of a new chapter, where divine intervention transformed the desert into a place of provision. God appeared to Hagar and Ishmael, not only to save them physically but also to reaffirm the promise that Ishmael would become the father of 12 princes and a great nation. This act of divine mercy is proof that God never abandons his children, even when they face the desert of rejection. Throughout his life, Ishmael grew and strengthened in the wilderness, developing skills that would be passed on to his descendants. Ishmael's people, the Ishmaelites, became known for their resilience, adaptability, and ability to thrive. In the midst of hardship, they lived as nomadic shepherds and traders, playing a significant role in the trade routes of the time, especially between the East and Egypt. This nomadic life was a physical expression of the prophecy that said Ishmael would be like a wild donkey, living free and untamed. The independence of the Ishmaelites, their ability to live on the margins, and their resistance to being controlled by other people are characteristics that echoed through the generations, fulfilling God's words. However, it is impossible to ignore the conflicts that arose between the descendants of Ishmael and those of Isaac. Although they were cousins, sharing the same ancestry through Abraham, tensions between the Ishmaelites and Israelites repeatedly manifested throughout biblical history. This conflict reflects, in part, the initial separation between Ishmael and Isaac, a division that was accentuated by Abraham's decision to send Ishmael and Hagar away. Although this gesture, while difficult, laid the foundation for the emergence of two great peoples, who, though linked by Abraham's lineage, would follow different paths. The rivalry between the Ishmaelites and Israelites can be seen as a broader metaphor for the conflicts that arise when different groups struggle for space and recognition within the divine plan. These tensions, however, do not overshadow the reality that God fulfilled his promises to both sides. Both Isaac and Ishmael were blessed, each in a unique way. Ishmael did not receive the messianic covenant that would come through Isaac's lineage, but he did receive the promise that his descendants would be numerous and powerful. He became the father of 12 princes, whose tribes spread across the vast region of the Arabian desert. Even amidst rivalries, this blessing is a testament to God's faithfulness to his words. God does not act arbitrarily or partially. He fulfills his promises to all those to whom he promises, regardless of their position in the main narrative. As we look at Ishmael's legacy, we see that he is more than a secondary figure in Abraham's story. His descendants had a profound and lasting impact on the Middle East and beyond. According to Islamic tradition, Ishmael is the direct ancestor of the Arabs and is therefore directly linked to the rise of Islam. This aspect of Ishmael's story highlights how God's promises can have ramifications that go far beyond what we can imagine. Ishmael's blessing extended not only to his immediate tribes, but also to a lineage that would become fundamental to one of the world's major religions. This shows the depth and breadth of God's plan, which always goes beyond what we can see or understand at first. As we reflect on Ishmael's life, we are also called to consider the spiritual lessons that his story offers us. First, it teaches us that even when we feel rejected or left behind, God still has a plan for us. Ishmael was expelled from Abraham's home, but God never abandoned him. Instead, He cared for him and Hagar, providing them with water in the desert and reaffirming the promise of a great nation. This reminds us that even in our toughest struggles, God is present, guiding us and fulfilling His promises in our lives. No matter where we are, in the desert or in the heart of the city, God sees our need and acts to sustain us. Ishmael's story also challenges us to rethink our understanding of blessing and promise. In Ishmael's case, he wasn't chosen to be the bearer of the Messianic covenant, but that doesn't mean he wasn't blessed. We often fall into the trap of thinking that if we're not at the center of something big, we're not important to God. Ishmael's life shows us that this is not true. God has blessings for everyone, and He fulfills His promises in unique ways for each of us. Although Ishmael wasn't at the center of Abraham's covenant, he still played a crucial role in God's plan, and his lineage continues to impact the world today. Another important point is that Ishmael's story challenges us to consider how we deal with rivalries and conflicts. The rivalry between Ishmael and Isaac and between their descendants can be seen as a metaphor for the conflicts that arise between peoples and groups who share common roots but follow different paths. However, the fact that God blessed both teaches us that His will is not to perpetuate divisions, but to call us to reconciliation and mutual understanding. Although the tensions between the descendants of Ishmael and Isaac were real, God's blessing for both shows that there is room for everyone in the divine plan. We can learn from this to seek peace and reconciliation in our own relationships, recognizing that even amidst differences, we are all part of God's creation. In concluding our reflection on Ishmael, we are reminded that the biblical narrative is ultimately a story about God's faithfulness. Ishmael's life is proof that God fulfills His promises, even to those who may seem on the sidelines of history. He abandons no one, and His blessings extend to all who are part of His plan. At the same time, Ishmael's story calls us to trust in God in all circumstances, knowing that even when things don't happen the way we expect, God is working to fulfill His promises in our lives. So, Ishmael's life, marked by challenges and blessings, invites us to trust in God's faithful character, to recognize that everyone has a role to play in the divine plan, and to seek peace and reconciliation even amidst rivalries. May we, like Ishmael, live with the confidence that God is with us, even in the most difficult deserts, and that His promises to us are always true. May this message touch your heart and inspire you to trust more and more in God's promises. Don't forget to share this content and subscribe to the channel to continue receiving more transformative stories from God's Word. May God's blessings be upon you and your family today and always. If you've made it this far, it's because you have a deep desire to learn more about God's Word, isn't it? Then I have a special gift for you. Below, I've left 2 video suggestions that I'm sure will further enrich your faith and understanding. Don't miss this opportunity. Click now on the first comment of this video to discover something that can transform your life. We'll meet there. May God bless you abundantly.